So I've come to realize that for a lot of people ordering the new Red Komodo camera, it's going to be their first time using a Red camera. So I wanted to make this little video because there's specific tools that are available on Red camera systems that are not available on any other cameras. Now these are exposure-specific tools that are essential for when shooting in Red Code RAW, but if you don't know how to use the tools correctly, then it could hurt your footage quite significantly. So I've been prepping for the Komodo for quite some time, and last year I took a little workshop here in LA to get certification as a Red camera operator, and in that workshop they recommended this book to us right here. Now this was published 5 years ago by Red Digital Cinema. It's called The Rules of Engagement, and it's a resource for professional and aspiring Red shooters. It's a really wonderful guide for not only operating and understanding Red cameras and their workflow on set, but also kind of walks you through how to deal with R3D RAW files in post. And it's kind of funny because before I took the workshop, I was hired to be the cinematographer on a couple projects where I was shooting on the DSMC2 bodies. So I was shooting on the Scarlet and the Dragon. And then later after those shoots, I took the workshop and realized, oh crap, I think I was using those cameras wrong. So I'm gonna try my best to explain these tools to all of you today, and hopefully you won't find yourselves in a similar situation. So the biggest rule of thumb here, if you don't remember anything else from today's video, just remember this, that a little minor underexposure is completely acceptable and usually even recoverable from, whereas a little minor overexposure is a recipe for disaster. And just like it says in the book, in regards to exposure, it's best to be as technically correct as possible on set and save all creative choices regarding exposure for post. And a lot of the confusion comes from the old theory of ETTR, or exposed to the right, which in a nutshell just means record as much light as possible. And I'm sure you still read it on the forums today where people say the Red sensors are just super thirsty for light, just get as much light as you can. And that could be a dangerous thing if you're not using the tools correctly. So the reason why this old theory of ETTR is so dangerous in regards to digital cinema cameras is because it's an old theory adopted from stills photography that is based off of IRE values. And why that's such a dangerous thing is because the IRE values is a relative scale based off of reflected light and not so much the raw image data. And if you're shooting in a digital cinema camera, specifically like a Red, I'm assuming you're shooting in R3D RAW, so wouldn't you want to know what's really going on with that sensor? So let's dive into the Komodo now and we'll take a closer look at this. Okay folks, so I've adjusted the lighting in here because we're primarily going to be looking at the LCD screen of the Komodo here. I needed it more controllable to do today's demo, right? So when we first look at the LCD screen here, what we're looking at here is the information of our format and project settings, but if we tap this, now we can see the RGB histogram. And this is very familiar to other histograms that you're used to looking at, right? Except the only difference is this is showing us each color channel, the red, green, and blue, right? The histogram is something that you really only want to use for a quick reference. Because much like the ETTR theory, the histogram is basing its values off of the IRE scale, which is only reflected light, right? What we really want to pay attention to in regards to what's going on with our raw image data is the traffic lights and the goalposts, and that's over here. Now what's cool about the Komodo is it's a little different than the other like Red cameras that I've operated, where usually on other Red cameras like the Scarlet, you only have a goalpost on the shadow end and one goalpost on the highlight end. But here they've given us 3 goalposts for the highlights and 3 goalposts for the shadows. And the reason they did that is because now we have a goalpost for each respective color channel, as well as we now have 6 traffic lights versus 3 in like some of the other DSMC2 bodies. So let me break this down for you a little more. Each of these traffic lights represents 2% of the pixels in that color channel, whether they're clipped or underexposed, and the goalposts represent 1/4 of all the pixels in that respective color channel. So right now we're looking at this and we see, okay, everything seems to be perfectly exposed. None of our traffic lights are on. We have none of the goalposts getting filled up. Our histogram is living in the middle. We're pretty good here, right? And you'll notice we are on a 360-degree shutter angle and 800 ISO. Here's something what I want to do. I'm going to say, why are we on 360 shutter angle? Let's drop this down. We're going to do a narrative thing here. Let's change it to 180. So now we're at 180-degree shutter angle, and you'll notice our red traffic light now has come on. Now that's letting me know that 2% of all the red pixels are now underexposed. But notice our histogram still looks pretty healthy. Now what some people might think is they say, oh, in order to fix those red pixels that are getting under, I'm gonna just jack up my ISO a little bit. So let's go to 1600. And as you'll see here, yeah, our image looks like it's getting brighter, and our histogram is showing that it shifted over, but our red traffic light's still on. What's going on? Okay, let's jack up the ISO more. This is crazy. Let's go to 4000 ISO. Well, now our histogram is still slightly moving over to the right, so let's go, okay, but look at there, my red traffic light is still on. Let's jack that ISO as high as it'll go, 12,800. Now our histogram is set dead in the middle, but our red traffic light is still on. You want to pay attention to what's paying attention to the raw image data. And your traffic lights and goalposts are pulling its information directly from the raw image data, whereas your histogram, much like the ETTR theory, is pulling its information from the IRE scale. An IRE scale is just based off of the reflected light in the image, right? So if you're basing off of the histogram alone, you could find yourselves in a lot of trouble when you're shooting an R3D RAW and you go into post and you go, what's going on here? There's underexposure here. Maybe you've heard people say where red cameras don't really have a native ISO. And this is why, this prime example here. So let's jump in here real quick. Let's tap these goalposts and we can get in here and let's turn on our exposure false color, right? So I'm gonna turn on the exposure false color. Now you'll notice there's exposure false color and then there's video false color. Now again, this is where it can get very confusing if you don't know the difference between the two. The video false color, much like the histogram, is basing its information off of the IRE scale. But if you want to see what's really going on with your raw image data, you're going to want to turn on the exposure false color. And exposure false color is specifically honed in on the highlights and the underexposed areas. All your underexposed areas in your image are going to be purple. All your clipped areas are going to be red, right? So now I have the exposure false color tool turned on, right? We're going to get out of this. And we see here we're at 4000 ISO, 2% of my red is clipped. But to exaggerate this a little more, I'm going to go even darker here. So I'm closing my f-stop so we can show this a little more. And now you'll see there. Okay, so now what we're looking at is, this is the purple I was talking about. And if you look here, all three of our traffic lights in the shadows have now come on. So that means that 2% of all red, green, and blue pixels are now completely underexposed. You'll see that half of the green goalpost is full, and I think it looks like all of the red goalpost is full, and dang near all the blue goalpost is full. So this is very bad. In general, what Red has mentioned in the workshop and in the book is that the goalposts in the shadow area can actually be acceptable all the way up to 50% full. Because remember, the goalpost, when it's completely full, represents a quarter of all the pixels in that respective color channel. But if you're living, you can go up to 50% in the shadow goalposts and still have an acceptable amount of digital noise, and even recoverable. But when it comes to the goalposts in the highlight regions, they're not nearly as forgivable. And the way it was presented to us, that you don't want anything peeking into those goalposts on the highlight end, right? Whereas with the shadow goalposts, it's a little bit more forgivable. So let's dive in here and take a peek at this. So you'll see now we're in a lot of trouble. So most people would say, okay, let me jack up this ISO and we'll fix this. But look, I'm jacked as high up as I can go, 12,800 ISO, and nothing changed on my goalposts or my traffic lights. So this is where I want to talk about how Red doesn't really have a native ISO, and that's because of the way Red digital cinema cameras apply ISO to the raw image. The way they use ISO is more like a lookup table, right? It's just changing the brightness or darkness of the image, but not really doing anything to the raw image data, okay? And maybe you've heard the phrase FLUT, or F-L-U-T, when people talk about Red cameras. And what that FLUT basically means is a floating lookup table. That's what the ISO is doing. It's just floating up and down the image, you know, changing the brightness or darkness of the image, but not doing anything to the raw image data. So the only way you can really adjust the underexposure that's happening here is three ways. You got to increase the light in the scene, you have to adjust your f-stop, or you have to change your shutter angle. That's the only way we're going to get out of these highly underexposed goalposts, okay? Now, another way you can do this is, if you don't know the difference between the exposure false color and the video false color, here's a prime example. I've turned off exposure false color, and I'm going to turn on video false color. Okay, so now video false color is turned on, and then I go in here and change the ISO. Now we see big differences happening. Way bigger drastic differences are happening to my false color when we're looking at the video false color. But again, nothing is changing with those goalposts or traffic lights, right? And you say, well, the false color is changing, the histogram's moving, but nothing's happening there. And that's because video false color is basing its information off of the IRE scale as well, whereas exposure false color is getting all of its information from the raw image data. So some people would say, well, why would you even need the video false color then? Well, because the video false color is better for, you need the IRE scale so you can get all those middle tones and assess what's going on with your middle gray and your skin tones and all of that. Whereas the exposure false color is more fine-tuned specifically for the shadows and the highlights, right? So in this case, all I'm gonna do is I'm going to crank open this f-stop more, and here you'll see everything is changing. Now we are perfectly exposed again, and our ISO is jacked way up. So I'm gonna push this ISO back down to, most guys would tell you to stay at ISO 800. And there you go. And as you'll see, nothing changed on those GoPros or traffic lights again with that ISO. Again, the ISO is just a floating LUT when it comes to RED digital cinema cameras. The reason why RED doesn't really have a native ISO is because their sensors are designed a little differently. The definition behind a native ISO is just because that's the ISO that like for instance, the Pocket 4K. The Pocket 4K's first native ISO is 400, right? That's because Blackmagic Design found that the most photons are hitting the sensor at 400, right? It's just what they've found in their development of the camera. Whereas RED, no matter what ISO it's sitting on, the same amount of photons are hitting the sensor no matter what ISO it is. And that's because the way it applies ISO as a lookup table, right? So that's something really to take note of here, is how different these RED digital cinema cameras are compared to other cameras that you're coming from. Even from something like a Blackmagic. Blackmagic applies its ISO totally different from the way that RED applies its ISO. Now again, if you are shooting Blackmagic RAW, ISO is still essentially metadata, but the ISO is still not really being applied in the same way that RED applies its ISO, right? So now look at this. Now we have a problem here. So now I've changed the light in the room. I've opened up that shutter angle for this example. And you'll see here now all three of the traffic lights in the highlight area are all turned on. So that means that 2% of my red, green, and blue pixels are completely gone, and the goalposts are completely full. Now obviously this would never be a good idea. So you go, okay, we just need to jack this ISO all the way down to 250. As you'll see, again, it did nothing. And then if we go in here and we turn on our exposure false color, we can see, oh yeah, that's big time, right? And the only way we can change that is by adjusting our f-stop on the lens or adjusting the actual lighting in the scene. And there you'll see all that red is now going away. And you'll notice that with the exposure false color, it's still showing us the middle gray as well, which is nice, right? It is nice that it's still showing us where the middle gray is, but really we're looking for those areas that are completely under, right? We're looking for those areas that are like this, right? And here you'll see now we're completely underexposed. No matter what I do with my ISO, those shadows are not really going away, right? Now, as you'll notice when we get higher to really high ISO, you'll see like, yeah, it kind of went away, but it did nothing in regards to our goalposts, right? So again, it's something that can only be changed with the lighting, whether it's f-stop, the lighting in the area, or your actual shutter angle. Okay, folks? So there you go. I know we got some weird, like creepy Halloween lighting here, but I hope that was beneficial for you, help you understand how to utilize ISO is more just a look that you're applying to the image, right? It's not really gonna help you in terms of real exposure on the raw image data. And make sure and let those goalposts be your friend. Let that exposure false color be your friend, and you should be okay, right? Assessing, turn on that exposure false color, look at your image and see what exactly is red or purple, and see, can my scene live with a little bit of red? Is it like a specular highlight, like a headlamp in the background? Well, yeah, obviously that's gonna be red. There's not a whole lot you can do with it. That's acceptable, right? But if you got red going on, like you're doing a product shoot, and red is half of the soup can, well, that's gonna be a problem, right? You really don't want any red showing up in any key part of your image, right? Because any of those clipped pixels is gonna be really, really hard to recover. In fact, probably not able to recover. Whereas the purple, like I said, those goalposts on the shadow end can get filled all the way up to 50% and still be an acceptable amount of digital noise. So I may have rambled on a little bit there, but it's kind of a lot to pack in because I know for me, it took me a little while to fully wrap my brain around this. But again, I'm not so much a technical guy as I am a creative guy. So that is one of the reasons why. But just like Robert Rodriguez told us, right? if you are a creative person and you can learn to be technical, you will be unstoppable, right? So if you're into this kind of content and you're new here, I encourage you to tap that subscribe button. And also, we do a lot of this kind of in-depth stuff, way longer, unedited kind of videos over on the Dog Times Patreon. I put out like an hour-long video once a week over there, just breaking down all kinds of stuff, but also it's kind of like an exclusive behind-the-scenes pass on my life as a DIY indie filmmaker in Los Angeles. So as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.